In April 1890, the remains of Joseph Carey Merrick were laid to rest in an unmarked grave in the East End of London.
Fleeth as it were a shadow and never continueth in one state.
But Merrick was no obscure pauper. He had become one of the most celebrated figures of Victorian society. He was the Elephant Man. In the 100 years since he died, medicine has made huge advances. But the case of the Elephant Man has never been laid to rest. Doctors in London have reopened his records in the hope of finally reaching a diagnosis for the condition that plagued Joseph Merrick's life.
Diagnosis is a detective story. It's a challenge to get the diagnosis right.
Diagnosis should be a science. It should be based on facts.
And for his surgical teaching to students. The next portrait is a professor...
The London hospital's most famous patient was brought to the attention of the world by one of its most famous surgeons, Sir Frederick Treves.
But the portrait I really want to show you is that of Sir Frederick Treves. He's famous for three reasons.
It will be for future generations of doctors to complete the history now passed on by Dr. David Hughes, curator of the London Hospital's Pathology Museum.
So his coronation had to be postponed, but he's best known for his description of and association with Joseph Merrick, the Elephant Man.
The thing arose slowly and let the blanket that covered its head and back fall to the ground. There stood revealed the most disgusting specimen of humanity that I have ever seen. In the course of my profession, I had come across lamentable deformities, but at no time had I met with such a degraded or perverted version of a human being as this lone figure displayed.
Treves wrote a highly personal and romanticized account of his relationship with the Elephant Man, changing Merrick's name from Joseph to John. It covered only the last 4 years of his life and became widely known through the highly acclaimed film The Elephant Man.
That's very good. All right, now. Hello, my name is John Merrick.
Hello, my name is John Merrick.
As a child, I was always told that there was no connection with the Elephant Man because of the similarity of the name, and especially with my first name, Jonathan. I was always teased about it at school. It never used to affect me as such because I was always told that, no, nothing to do with us. I suspect my grandmother knew, but she wouldn't tell anyone.
This man's great-grandfather was Joseph Merrick's cousin. It's a secret his wife uncovered by chance.
I'd been researching the family history and had got quite far back and managed to trace them through to then move up to Leicestershire. So I inquired at the record office, who told me that we were related to the Elephant Man, and that was the first I knew of it.
When we discovered there was a link, we actually read up about the Elephant Man, Joseph Merrick, and discovered the story, which is tragic and sad.
Shortly before he met Treves, Joseph had written his own account of his life. A mere 2 pages long, It tells of his early years.
I first saw the light on the 5th of August, 1860. I was born in Lee Street, Leicester. The deformity which I am now exhibiting was not perceived much at birth, but began to develop itself when at the age of 5 years. I went to school like other children until I was about 11 or 12 years of age, when the greatest misfortune of my life occurred, namely the death of my mother. Peace to her. She was a good mother to me.
Joseph Merrick's mother died when he was 10, and his father remarried, and the woman he remarried was not very compassionate to Joseph, and he didn't get on very well.
Together with my deformity, she was the means of making my life a perfect misery. I was taunted and sneered at, so that I would not go home to my meals, and used to stay in the streets with a hungry belly rather than return for anything to eat.
I think at 17 he headed off on his own. There was no way he could stay there. He used to hawk festival cigars and then haberdashery around door to door, which must have been a bit rough for him, because every time somebody opened the door and was confronted with him, he must have got a reaction off them each time. It couldn't have been a very nice life.
The Monday after Christmas, 1879, Joseph arrived at the doors of the Leicester workhouse.
Right, what we have here is the admission and discharge register. This is for the Leicester Poor Law Union workhouse. It covers the period when Joseph Merrick was going in and out of the workhouse. You can probably see quite clearly over here on the 29th of December, and there he is, Merrick Joseph. His calling is down as a hawker. His birth is given, various other details, and the reason that he was admitted is down as unable to work. It could well be that there was cold weather and a hawker, you know, there was no one about, so he couldn't sell things.
You tend to imagine people being put into the workhouse rather than going in voluntarily.
Yes.
It's quite a surprise to see that they did go in voluntarily.
Yes, it is an eye-opener in many ways, how brief some of the stays in the workhouse were. I think a lot of people went in, if they were ill, or if they broke their leg, they'd go in, and of course when they were better they could work again, and out they came.
3 years later, aged 20, Joseph had surgery for the first time.
I then went into the infirmary in Leicester, when I had to undergo an operation on my face, having 3 or 4 ounces of flesh cut away.
Nothing could stop the disease now, and Joseph realized he could turn his deformed body into an asset.
Joseph was very resourceful and very resilient. When he left the workhouse, he went off to exhibit himself in the freak shows. He did this voluntarily, and I would imagine that having gone door to door and having reactions from people, he was quite used to having been seen and seeing the reactions people would give him. It was a way of making a living, and probably the only one available to him at that time.
He joined forces with Sam Torr, a local impresario who was in the music hall business. He asked him to promote his career as a freak, and his first engagement was at the Gaiety Theatre. It's a building which still stands in Leicester today.
When I first came here, all the stage was virtually all there, with the wooden seating. This is about one of the few bits of the building that's actually left from the original parts that were about. And the rooms you're in now, as far as I know, were the changing rooms for Joseph Merrick and the other people that were appearing at the theatre.
Joseph was a star attraction, reveling in the details of his deformity.
The measurement round my head is 36 inches. There is a large substance of flesh at the back, while the face is such a sight that no one could describe it. The right hand is almost the size and shape of an elephant's foreleg. The other hand and arm is no larger than that of a girl of 10 years of age, although it is well proportioned. My feet and legs are covered with thick, lumpy skin, like that of an elephant, and almost the same color. In fact, no one could believe until they saw it that such a thing could exist. In making my first appearance before the public who have treated me well, in fact, I may say I am as comfortable now as I was uncomfortable before.
The money rolled in, his career took off, and the freak show went on the road.
When the travelling circus came down from Leicester, Joseph was displayed in a shop opposite the hospital. The site of that shop is now a sari shop, which you can see directly opposite the front of the hospital in the Whitechapel Road.
Unwittingly, Merrick had brought himself within a stone's throw of one of the most ambitious young surgeons in Britain.
In the 1880s, Treves was very much a rising star in the medical profession. Treves got to hear from one of his students that there was a man with monstrous case of deformity on show in an empty shop. His students knew that he was interested in cases of monstrous disease. He'd written several cases up in the medical press. So Treves was sufficiently interested to go and see this freak show, and met Joseph Merrick and persuaded him to come to visit him in his rooms in the London Hospital Medical College, which stands beside the London Hospital.
The deformity concerned both the cutaneous and osseous systems. With regard to the skin, the affected district showed a two-form abdomen. Thus, from the right axilla, a great flap of loose skin hung vertically downwards. This condition produced papillomatous growth was far more exuberant in some places than others. Thus, over the right pectoral, he never suffered from headache, and his intelligence was by no means of a low order.
It was at this examination that the first known photographs of Merrick were taken. A series of 4 plates, seen here for the first time on television. A permanent medical record of his terrible disfigurement. Unable to come up with a diagnosis, Treves persuaded Merrick to put on a private show, this time in front of London's prestigious pathological society.
Treves seems to have had a genuine scientific curiosity. He was eager to show this very unusual case, but some of his colleagues were critical that it was not appropriate to show someone who was essentially, in their terms, a freak, rather than someone who was acutely ill.
It was 1884, and the tide of public decency was turning against freak shows. The police moved Joseph on. With his livelihood threatened, Joseph traveled abroad in search of a new audience. He'd almost made enough money to give up touring when disaster struck.
Well, I think he was quite resourceful in a way. He managed to find his own way back from Belgium when he was robbed over there. And given his medical condition and his state, to be able to get back and get passage without any money at all, I think that shows his resourcefulness, really.
But worse was to come. When he arrived at London's Liverpool Street station, he faced the most terrifying experience of his life.
The police were called, and they found Treves' calling cards still in Joseph's pocket. So they brought him to the London hospital. Frederick Treves was called from his home and arranged for Joseph to be admitted onto Cotton Ward, a ward which had isolation rooms that had been used during the cholera outbreaks in the 1860s.
There's been, of course, a lot of hospital rebuilding, and the appearance now is very different to what it would have been in those days. It was here that Frederick Treves first brought Joseph Merrick when he brought him to the hospital, but due to his horrendous appearance and that upsetting some of the other patients, he was then moved to a more secluded attic room. Though the sort of patients we have in the hospital are pretty similar still.
Treves' actions broke all the rules, but ensured Merrick was now safe, temporarily at least. In the 2 years since they last met, his deformities had progressed at an alarming rate. He smelt dreadful and was now incapable of looking after himself. But Treves couldn't offer permanent security. The London hospital was not allowed to admit incurables, and as a last resort, Treves appealed to the chairman of the hospital, Francis Cargom, for help.
To the editor of the Times. Sir, I am authorized to ask your powerful assistance in bringing to the notice of the public the following most exceptional case. There is now in a little room of one of our attic wards a man... It is a case of singular affliction brought about through no fault of himself. He can but hope for quiet and privacy during a life which Mr. Treves assures me is not likely to be long. Can any of your readers suggest to me some fitting place where he can be received?
I think it would have been quite an unusual thing in context of the 1880s to write to the newspapers about an individual patient.
The chairman stated that the result had been the receipt of a very large number of letters and a considerable sum of money. About £100 had been sent for his health. The only other suggestions the chairman had received were to send him to a hospital for the blind, to lighthouses, or to Dartmoor.
These suggestions were not really taken seriously, but we know over £250 was sent in to the London hospital by the readers of the Times and placed in what was called the Merrick Fund. Now, that would have been a very considerable amount of money and provided sufficient monies really to look after Joseph for the rest of his life. Furthermore, a Mr. Singer offered to pay £50 to the hospital every year if they could keep Joseph here. And the committee records record that it was regarded that it was not only financially a sound thing to do, but it was the right thing to do, morally the most appropriate thing to do.
Joseph was officially discharged as a patient and given his own rooms in the hospital grounds in Bedstead Square.
I should like to say a few words of thanks to all those that came forward with help and sympathy after my case was made known by Mr. Cargom in the public press. I have a nice, bright room, made cheerful with flowers, books, and pictures. I am very comfortable, and I may say as happy as my condition will allow me to be.
Joseph had found sanctuary at last.
From the written records, he appears to have been quite happy. He liked to give gifts and to receive gifts. He made models and gave them to friends and visitors.
Of the many models he made, only this one now survives. It is a remarkably delicate piece of work. One letter also remains from this time at the hospital.
Many thanks for the grouse and this book you so kindly sent me. The grouse was splendid. With much gratitude, I am yours truly, Joseph Merrick.
Of all his visitors, his most faithful was his surgeon, now his friend.
One thing that always struck me as sad about Merrick was the fact that he could not smile. Whatever his delight might be, his face remained expressionless. He could weep, but he could not smile.
Treves knew, beneath the fine clothes, the man was deteriorating rapidly. His head had become so large he could barely support it, and his speech more and more difficult to understand. But even Treves didn't realize how brief his happiness would be.
To the editor of the Times. Sir, in November 1886, you were kind enough to insert in the Times a letter from me drawing attention last Friday, though apparently in his usual health, he quietly passed away in sleep.
Frustrated by the limitations of 19th century science, Frederick Treves still had no idea what had caused Joseph's dreadful deformities. But believing that doctors in the future might be able to tell what was wrong, he left them a legacy, a series of clues. A few days after Merrick died, a porter was instructed to make casts. The results were a triumph of Victorian artistry and reproduced faithfully the details of his tormented body. What was revealed within was more disturbing. Merrick's twisted skeleton displayed a body tortured from the inside. The surgeon involved in the Jack the Ripper case was also at the London hospital. It was he who preserved Merrick's bones by boiling and bleaching.
You are now in the museum here in the London Hospital Medical College. This museum is not usually open to the public. I hope it's something you'll make use of during your time of training as medical students. We have one of the best collections of pathological specimens in London. Our collection includes specimens from every part of the body. This is the elephant man, Joseph Merrick. Joseph himself always knew that his skeleton would be available for scientific study. Indeed, interest in the elephant man has continued long after his death, and scientists and doctors from all over the world come to look at the skeleton and puzzle over the diagnosis.
For decades, there were almost as many different diagnoses as there were doctors who examined Merrick's remains. Professor Gordon Seawood, a bone expert who was working in the London in the 60s, was one of them. At that time, the most popular diagnosis of Merrick's condition was neurofibromatosis, a disease which can cause abnormalities of the skin and bone. Seawood was the first to put this theory to the test.
I started to look at the skeleton systematically, first at the skull, and then worked down. I studied the texture of the bones, the surface markings, various knobbles, and so on, trying to look for evidence to support one or other hypothesis. I thought that the findings in his skeleton reasonably supported the historic diagnosis of neurofibromatosis.
Neurofibromatosis, or NF, is one of the most common genetic diseases affecting 100,000 people in the US. It's a disorder of nerve tissue that can cause benign tumors anywhere in the body, sometimes leading to severe disfigurement.
I've had 32 operations altogether. Most of them were done as a child. It was to improve my appearance, make it more symmetrical. Well, we'd been told that I've got neurofibromatosis, that it was hereditary, that it affects every system of the body, or it could do. And it's the luck of the draw as to how it affects you. I was 6 months old when this photograph was taken. There was no sign of having neurofibromatosis at that stage. And actually that makes me a bit sad to know that I wasn't born with a disfigured face that's happened during the years of having NF. It reminds me of what could have been and what isn't. Shortly after starting school, people used to stare at me. They used to call me fat face or crooked face or you don't belong here, you've come from another planet.
Although it's relatively common, in 1980, nobody had really heard of neurofibromatosis on either side of the Atlantic. But when the Elephant Man film was released in New York, a small charity saw a way of capitalizing on the link between Joseph Merrick and the disease to help current sufferers.
It was a very exciting opportunity. I mean, one thing you have to realize is that prior to the publicity about the Elephant Man, most people couldn't even pronounce neurofibromatosis, much less have heard of it. So the opportunity to have a major Hollywood film as a fundraising event was quite a big deal for this little mom and pop organization at the time.
They were all so busy arranging the premiere that nobody really thought the whole thing through.
As I walked in, I realized that this was not a theater filled with people from the movie industry, but there were a substantial number of patients and families who had neurofibromatosis, most of whom were my patients. It made me feel quite uneasy because I knew that the story of the Elephant Man was not going to be an easy one to face. I don't think people burst into tears, but I can tell you that I was pretty miserable during the performance, and I was quite uncomfortable thinking about what some of the parents who had children with this disorder might be thinking as this quite grotesque individual was portrayed on the screen.
Well, it took 3 attempts for me to actually watch the whole film. The first 2, I couldn't get past the opening sequence because of the bullying that he endured there. And it took me right back to the playground and having the same kind of bullying. And I couldn't deal with it, so I switched it off.
The premiere had the desired effect. NF moved center stage. And the small American charity moved up several blocks.
Good morning, the NF Foundation. This is Brandy.
Good morning. You've reached the National Neurofibromatosis
Good morning, the NF Foundation. This is Medina speaking. Can
Good
I
morning,
help
the
you?
NF Foundation. Cassandra speaking. May I help you? Here you go. Here's some more packets. Okay.
Suddenly, this was a medical condition that was no longer whispered about or was yet totally ignored. It was in the news. It was in print. And there was something positive about that fact alone, just to see the name neurofibromatosis in print. It seemed to signal that the dark ages might be over.
This is what the...
As the donations poured into the National NF Foundation, they were able to fund research programs. But the euphoria was short-lived. The association with Joseph Merrick had unforeseen side effects.
Presentation, I think.
As time went on, people began to realize what first was thought to be a blessing turned out to be a monstrous emotional burden. It produced startling experiences for people affected by the disorder. They began to be called Elephant Man, and that hurts. Nobody had ever been seen again like Joseph Merrick. In fact, the vast majority of patients looked nothing like the Elephant Man. And therefore, we were beginning to wonder whether the association was not more harmful than beneficial.
It's got consequences for all of us because people tend to associate NF with him, and very many people with NF don't like it because they think that they're going to end up as badly affected as he is.
There's a little one there. And let's have a look. Let's turn you around.
One of the reasons for the panic was that many people with NF lead entirely normal lives, hardly aware there is anything wrong with them.
Smooth, pale brown, coffee-coloured spot. So that's why the doctors call it cafe au lait.
All NF is likely to mean for 6-year-old Oliver Walker is a few skin blemishes.
We still sadly see people coming to the clinic who've gone, say, to the library and found old medical textbooks, and the first thing they read about is neurofibromatosis. This is the disease that Joseph Merrick, the elephant man, had. And if you've just received bad news and that's the next thing you heard, you meet people who are sure that this will happen and who have spent months watching their children waiting for them suddenly to become like the elephant man. Very typical small cafe au lait spots, but this is absolutely all he's got. And otherwise, he's a very lively, normal little boy, aren't you? If you have NF1, the first sign that appears are the cafe au lait spots, and they usually appear in the first year or two of life. That's it. There was one there, and there's some here, aren't they? Oh, very good. Let's have a look.
I've got lots.
You've got lots? They really don't do any harm medically, and in fact 10% of us have one or two of them. It's just that in NF1 you very characteristically have 6 or more. And so if as a doctor you see that, then you know that that makes the diagnosis of NF1 almost definite.
Do any of them actually cause you any pain?
No, they were a bit, I suppose. The neurofibromas begin to appear usually in the teens or 20s, and they are discrete small lumps actually on the nerve endings in the skin. Trunk. You haven't really got...
Oliver's mother has more pronounced signs, but even so, they're only really a cosmetic problem. She had a 50% chance of passing it on to her son, and in their case, there's no doubt about the diagnosis. But in the early 80s, 2 American doctors began to question the diagnosis of some NF patients. They had come across a number of children with a host of extra abnormalities that did not seem to fit. Professor Mike Cohen and his colleague had discovered a completely new disorder. It became known as Proteus syndrome.
Proteus was a Greek god who could change his shape at will to avoid capture. And since Proteus syndrome has such a variety of different findings in it, it was a very, very good name.
When Mike Cohen was called out to see a child who was said to look like the elephant man, it started him thinking.
John Tibbles and I both knew that Joseph Merrick was thought to have had neurofibromatosis. Since neurofibromatosis and Proteus syndrome had been confused in our patient, we wondered whether Joseph Merrick might have had Proteus syndrome.
Unlike NF, Proteus is extremely rare. It can cause any type of body tissue to grow too much, leading to all sorts of disfigurements.
We had a collection of about 12 patients, and what we did was to take the findings about Joseph Carey Merrick and compare them to the findings in neurofibromatosis and Proteus syndrome. And Joseph Merrick matched much better for Proteus syndrome and not really at all for neurofibromatosis.
Cohen realized the bony lumps on Merrick's head were not seen in NF, but were seen in some of his Proteus patients. And when he looked at photographs of Merrick's foot, he saw wrinkles and bumps which he believed were unique to Proteus syndrome. Looking back at the historical descriptions, there was no mention of the telltale cafe au lait spots of NF either. Cohen rushed into print with the first new theory for 20 years.
I must say that at the time, my pride was a little bit punctured because, as far as I know, he hasn't actually been over and examined the evidence presented by the photographs, the skeleton, and the casts himself.
"100 years after his death, it is time for the London hospital's most famous patient to be examined once again. This time with the technology and knowledge of the 1990s.
At BASF, we don't make the sunscreen, we make it stronger. We don't make the...
Joseph Merrick actually died 5 years before the discovery of X-ray, so he would not have been X-rayed at the time. We thought it would be interesting to use the new technology to look at his skeleton
The CT scanner would allow radiologist Dr. Amita Sharma to see features within the bone invisible to the naked eye.
We actually brought down the skeleton one Sunday afternoon and performed plain x-rays of the whole of the skeleton and also performed spiral CT scans, which we then reconstructed so that you get a three-dimensional image. What we wanted to do was to offer a diagnosis from the radiological features, so whether the features actually did fit those that we see in patients with neurofibromatosis, whether they fitted those that have been reported with the Proteus syndrome, and or whether they actually excluded those diagnoses and offered a different diagnosis.
Meanwhile, another potential source of evidence had emerged in an unlikely place, the Royal Palace of Hampton Court. There, Joseph's hat and mask were being worked on at the Textile Conservation Centre.
I've never seen a hat as large as Joseph Merrick's hat, the sheer scale of it. I was interested in the construction. The hat was in poor condition and needed conserving.
On closer inspection, the veil revealed something unexpected.
I was very excited when I found the stains in the sense of the connection with Joseph Merrick. I thought the DNA might be extracted. I contacted several private laboratories to see how far forensic tests would be able to take the analysis.
The saliva stains proved too old to provide the hoped-for DNA. But could there be an alternate source? The London called in an expert to examine the skeleton. Dr. Nalin Thacker's first problem was where to find some DNA.
The story goes that the skeleton's been bleached twice, and that would have removed any organic material which we would hope to get the DNA from. I feel DNA from the tooth would be a better bet.
The very treatment that had preserved the skeleton had turned out to be a major obstacle.
The tooth that has always been in the skull.
Right. Would you be able to burst straight through into the pulp and,
oh, yes.
and collect?
I'm hoping to open it as I would for a routine endodontic procedure.
Dentist Dr. John Richards has to ensure that everything's sterile so as not to contaminate the sample.
The first thing we have to do is cut a hole in the tooth, remove the hard surface of the tooth, which is the enamel, and then we go into the dentine and the pulp of the tooth, where we hope to find some remains of soft tissues that are present normally in the tooth.
I've made access to the pulp chamber and just taken the roof off it in one point.
Okay.
I wanted to collect all this dentine if possible. We'll go back in again, I think.
Although the collection seemed to go well, when Dr. Thacker returned to his lab, he was unable to extract DNA from the sample. He plans to make another attempt. There should have been another source of DNA. Frederick Treves had had the foresight to preserve skin samples at the time of Joseph's death. They would have provided all the answers, but sadly, they were destroyed in the Blitz. But one clue still remains from the Treves legacy. Dr. John Harper from Great Ormond Street Hospital in London has probably seen more cases of the rare Proteus syndrome than anyone else in Britain. He also has patients with neurofibromatosis. As a dermatologist, he can examine Joseph's skin in detail by using the casts.
And he obviously had quite prominent lumps. Can I just ask you, these lumps, are they bony, or how much of that is soft tissue, skin and flesh swelling?
Well, it's almost certainly a mixture of both, about half of each. We had 2 American pathologists who came a few years ago.
I think that there were certain things that I homed in on when I was thinking about the possible different diagnoses. As well as the bony enlargement, you can see what I presume to be thickened, irregular skin, is it
Yes,
correct?
I think this is thickened, irregular skin here, and this would be bone there, so you can see the skin, as it were, laid on top of the bone. He did have one leg longer than the other, so he had a built-up shoe, but he used to walk around Whitechapel with a stick.
I mean, it has enormous impact on me looking at this. there's clear difference between what was, I presume, to be normal skin and this very thickened, irregular, probably warty skin on the other arm. In fact, if I look at the main cast, on the chest wall there is a clear demarcation between what is abnormal skin and this area, which probably is normal.
Joseph himself was said to have been normal at birth and begun to grow tumours, particularly around the face, when he was about 20 months old.
Presumably abnormalities could have been handling the casts, having read the literature on Joseph Merrick, made it come to life. It was almost like examining him. You know, I could actually feel and touch what I'd read about, and in a way that did help me somewhat diagnostically.
Frederick Treves had been unable to diagnose Joseph Merrick's condition, but has his legacy led today's doctors nearer to solving the mystery of what was wrong with the Elephant Man?
These are probably the most unusual x-rays that I have ever seen. His right hand shows enlargement of the right ring and little fingers, which is seen in neurofibromatosis, but it's also a very distinctive feature of the Proteus syndrome. These x-rays of the skull really do resemble a condition called fibrous dysplasia, but if you'd looked at that in combination with the rest of the skeleton, then that diagnosis would no longer fit. Looking at his legs, now if you looked at this bone on its own, it would look like Paget's disease, but again that doesn't really fit because that condition affects patients who are much older. I think if we'd been given all of these x-rays separately, then looking at each one in turn, we may have come to a different diagnosis with every single x-ray. It was the combination of features that led us to one diagnosis and against another. We felt it was the Proteus syndrome rather than neurofibromatosis that was causing these changes.
I think that everybody who has examined Joseph Merrick has really given their best opinion at that point in time. And at this stage now, I think that the highest contender is Proteus syndrome. I mean, it's even possible that the diagnosis will be even further refined in the future. He has features that are unique to him, and they still defy definitive diagnosis. I mean, maybe he needs to be separately defined. Maybe he has Merrick's disease.
Whatever the eventual diagnosis, Joseph's condition has not recurred in the Merrick family.
I didn't have any bad feelings about being linked with Joseph Merrick. The way he reacted and the way he lived his life, I think, was remarkable.
I think he's helped us perhaps understand some of these groups of disorders and is in a way continuing to contribute knowledge in medicine.
So if somebody came to you, they would come to you with a child with a similar condition starting, would you be able to stop that from developing to that extent?
Well, I think there's certainly a lot that we would do for sure. He would need the involvement, not just of a skin specialist like myself, but he would require a plastic surgeon to remove some of that tissue, to debulk that arm, to make it lighter and easier to use. The skull is a big problem, and I think that we would certainly ask the advice of craniofacial surgeons, particularly with these very large bony lesions, and I'm sure that something could be done to help him surgically.
Everyone now agrees Merrick did not have NF. Medical progress means that those born with severe disfigurements will not suffer physically the way he had to. But little has changed to lessen the emotional and psychological scars.
I can tell by people's eyes if I'm going to be accepted or rejected. I think faces are very important because that's the first thing that people will see. And if they don't like what they see, they don't go any further. They don't see you as a person. They just see you as a facial disfigurement and something not quite right.
Thanks for watching. If you'd like to help us produce more compelling historical content like this, please like, comment below, and share this video with fellow history buffs. And of course, be sure to subscribe to help keep history happening.